Welcome to the Explainer. Look, today we're just going to skip the usual rundown and jump straight into the deep end of a massive 1,500-year-old theological puzzle. We're looking at one of the most vivid, mysterious, and honestly highly debated passages in all of historical literature, the story of the two witnesses from the book of Revelation. But we're not just reading it, we are going to decode it. We've got two brilliant ancient analytical minds helping us out, and trust me, this is absolutely going to change how you look at apocalyptic symbolism. Okay, let's dive right into this. I want you to picture this scene in your head because it's incredibly cinematic. You have two dead bodies lying right there in the streets of a great city, and for 3.5 days, their enemies are literally celebrating their deaths. But then, out of nowhere, the unthinkable happens. A sudden breath of life from God enters them, and they just stand right up on their feet. Imagine the sheer shock of witnessing that. It's such a dramatic, literal stage that Revelation chapter 11 sets up for us. But, this immediately begs a pretty massive question. Are these really just two individual guys, or are they a symbol for something way bigger? To figure this out, we're bringing in our ancient expert decoders, Tychonius and Andrew of Caesarea. See, these scholars didn't just look at Revelation as some weird list of future events. No, they saw it as a profound code-breaking exercise. They looked right past that literal surface to unearth the deep spiritual realities operating behind the text.
Which brings us to Section 1, the breath of life.
Now, what's really interesting here is the pure logic Tychonius brings to the table. He asks a super practical question. How could those who dwell on the earth rejoice at the death of two men if they died in only one city? He points out that the text literally describes people all over the globe rejoicing, throwing feasts, even exchanging presents over the deaths of these witnesses. Tychonius logically deduces that, hey, if this were just two literal guys in one local town, the whole earth wouldn't be throwing a party. So this has to point to a massive, global, symbolic event, not just some isolated historical blip. And because of that global scale, Tychonius decodes this breath of life not as just two guys waking up, but as the general resurrection. We're talking about the ultimate end-of-time event where all flesh rises from the grave at the second coming of Christ. When the people still living see the sudden rising of the dead, it causes this horrible, stupefying fear. And even more importantly, Tychonius notes that this event acts as the ultimate filter, permanently separating the just from the unjust. Let's see how the narrative moves forward in Section 2, Ascending the Clouds. Andrew of Caesarea gives us this magnificent description for what happens next. He decodes the cloud they ascend on as the dominical chariot. It's such a striking, fascinating phrase, isn't it? It emphasizes that we aren't just looking at some random weather phenomenon here. This is a divine royal vehicle serving as their direct transport into heaven. It perfectly captures the sheer majesty of the ascension. They are literally being escorted into the heavenly realms with full honors. And obviously, seeing a visual miracle like that creates a stark, intense psychological reaction. The text notes that a great fear fell on those who saw them. Remember, just days prior, these enemies were having a party, mocking the dead, leaving their bodies out in the streets. Now, their courage is totally gone, their reason is completely stupefied. That sudden, undeniable realization of divine power just shatters their worldly confidence into a million pieces. But the spectacle up in the sky is immediately followed by absolute terror down on the ground. That brings us to Section 3, the Great Spiritual Earthquake. And this brilliantly illustrates how our ancient decoders completely agree on the deeper meaning of these physical events. Both Andrew and Tychonius say, look, this earthquake isn't about physical geology, it's a metaphor. Andrew sees it as a spiritual transposition, basically shaking away all the unstable, tottering things to reveal what is eternally firm and secure. Tychonius takes a similar angle, viewing it as the violent fall of perverse doctrine. It's this massive spiritual shaking happening within the church itself, designed to test the very foundations of the faith. So now we need to look at the aftermath. Here's Section 4, Decoding the Destruction. The text gives us highly specific metrics, starting with 1/10 of the city falling. But Tychonius argues we shouldn't read this as exactly 10% of a literal brick-and-mortar city. In biblical symbolism, the number 10 is a perfect number. It represents totality. So 1/10 falling actually means the entire city of corruption falls. It completely takes down the builders who allowed all those perverse false doctrines to be built up within the temple of their hearts. Then we get another incredibly specific number, 7,000 people killed in the earthquake. Here, Andrew steps in with a really fascinating piece of decoding. He says the number 7 represents the 7 days of our present earthly life. So the 7,000 who are killed, they symbolize the people who tragically attach themselves exclusively to the material world those 7 days and completely miss the 8th day, which represents eternity in the resurrection. Because they clung so tightly to the temporary, they're entirely swept away when the temporary gets shaken.
This brings us to the ultimate outcome in Section 5, the final division.
So, the really crucial point here is Tychonesius' architectural metaphor for the two starkly different factions dwelling within the church. When this spiritual earthquake hits, everything gets tested. Those built on the sand, the ones holding on to perverse doctrine, they crumble straight away under the violence of present dangers and face punishment. But those built upon the rock, they completely withstand the danger. They maintain the pure faith of the true church, and because of that firm foundation, they are preserved. Let's actually walk through the psychological progression of these righteous survivors, the ones built on the rock. First, they are terrified by the sheer destructive power of the earthquake as they watch the unrighteous perish. I mean, they're scared they might share in the punishment. Second, this intense fear drives them to urgently confess the Christian name. And third, when they finally realize they've been mercifully spared from the torments, they actively glorify the God of heaven. It's a profound journey from total terror to confession to a place of deep, deep gratitude. All of this leads to a pretty intense, almost shocking quote that Tychonius brings in from the Psalms to explain their mindset. He says, "The righteous will rejoice when he sees vengeance. He will wash his hands in the blood of the sinner." Now, I know that sounds incredibly brutal to modern ears, but Tychonius explains that witnessing this ultimate divine judgment actually frees the righteous. Seeing the definitive end of wickedness and the absolute vindication of truth, it causes them to increase in obedience, acting with even greater joy and purity, because they know that justice has finally been served. Which leaves us with this final thought. As the world shakes, as the foundations are tested, and as the final division between the rock and the sand actually occurs, what is the true nature of the second death? Is it just physical destruction, or is it the eternal consequences of being tethered to a crumbling, temporary world? Andrew and Tychonius are really inviting us to look way past the literal earthquakes and falling buildings and to examine the architecture of our own beliefs. Because when the final shaking comes, only what is eternally secure is going to remain.